Hello, everyone. It's really lovely to see you all here today. My name is Professor Elizabeth Hurren, and I'm here in the School of History at the University of Leicester. Thank you for joining us. I'm going to have a chat with you today about the murder mystery surrounding Jack the Ripper, and that's what I'm doing at the moment with my second year, so I thought you might like to enjoy joining in with us and thinking about who Jack might have been. So when we study Jack the Ripper, what we find is that we are looking at what's called the art of the melodrama. And in fact, during this time is when newspapers started to feature for the very first time the sketches of crime scenes. But as you can see, they're very much ramped up for public consumption, and that's something that we need to think about. It's also the time in which we have the rise of new journalism, and new journalism was a new style of newspapers, and it really was about fear. We think that fear and fake news are something new, but actually they're not. Here we can see Jack's hands on the right. We can see the detectives in the middle being mocked, Detective Thick, because they weren't getting anywhere. And then some of the posters that appeared around the East End area advertising the mutilation of women, and really quite fearful. We'll also review the Victorian photography and the social photography of the scene, because we're very lucky that photography got underway in this time, and we'll be able to look at all of the crime scene evidence and each of the places where actually the victims were murdered. Now, there's no doubt that the Victorian press created a moral panic around this, and they did so because they wanted to be the authentic voice of the people. Again, something that sounds very modern to us today, but the Victorians started this trend. In fact, they created in Jack the Ripper the first global celebrity criminal, and they published photographs, as you can see here, of the post-mortem photography in a way that we wouldn't actually do today. So it was really about true crime selling for the first time. And this gives us as historians lots and lots of evidence to sift in our cold case review. We'll be starting here. This is Dorset Street. This is 1888. Imagine that it's been a very cold summer, and then suddenly it's very, very warm. And the street smells because it's quite polluted. And there are about 1,200 people who are walking up and down the street every day. And as you can see, there's a lot of people who are in social deprivation. They're living in what historians call the edge of relative to absolute poverty. And Jack is going to walk into the street, and he's going to kill 4 out of his 5 iconic victims on this street. So we're going to have to get very used to it. We're going to have to engage in it. And we're going to ask ourselves one question. What did the Victorians know about Jack that we haven't worked out? Because there is no book on the New York Times bestseller list that has worked this out. Paul Begg, who's a bit of an expert on this area, has published a great book, Jack the Ripper, The Facts. And in it, as he points out, it has to be acknowledged that Dorset Street features prominently in the story of most of the victims. So we're going to reimagine the local scene. Here in the photograph, you can see one of the lodging house bedrooms that you would have bought for the night. Sometimes these were bought by people who were dining out. Often they were used by prostitutes who would pay about 2 shillings 6pence to share a bed with 5 or 6 people. The street itself is about half a mile long, and 1,500 people walked up and down it every night. So it begs the question, what did Jack know about this human cauldron that we don't know? Why did he not fear getting caught along this street? Indeed, there were 3 pubs on the street, the Britannia at the bottom of the street, the Horn of Plenty in the middle of the street, and the Blue Coat in the top of the street. Prostitutes walked up and down at these pubs, and Jack will deliberately target prostitutes as his main victims. He'll know that they're in the inner courts of the street, and somehow he was walking the streets even though there were so many people on the street. So we're going to keep in mind 5 things. Firstly, Jack is a serial killer, and all serial killers are very methodical about the way that they kill. His homicide method was very methodical, and so he chose this street scene for a reason. It wasn't random. So there's something about it that was very familiar to contemporaries and Jack, but historians haven't actually been able to work out about it, and that's our challenge. Can we do so in a cold case review? So we'll look at the street furniture and we'll be asking ourselves about its social wallpaper. How did Jack have a nondescript look? How did he blend in? How did he walk up and down the street? Why did nobody fear him as the murders went on? So we'll also ask ourselves a little bit more about the street scene, and we'll be mapping it out. There was a big convent at one end of the street in the Yellow Arrow. There was also a Church of England right in the middle of the street with a graveyard. And there were 3 public houses that I mentioned, one at the top of the street, one in the middle of the street, and one at the end. There were large lodging houses. So the question is, what have they got in common? Why were people on this street more vulnerable to Jack? Maybe he worked on the street. Maybe he was a gravedigger. Maybe he stood outside the public houses. Maybe he went to the night shelter at the top of the street. Somewhere on this street was Jack walking up and down looking for those victims. Let's think about some of Jack's forensic clues that he left behind too. There's no question that to commit these murders, he must have had extraordinary physical strength. He had a very methodical way of killing, and he killed very fast and very accurately. He killed each of his victims in somewhere between 6 to 10 minutes. And remember what I said, there were 1,500 people on the street. So he killed fast, he killed quick, he had a way of disguising himself as social wallpaper, and he was able then to blend with the crowd and simply walk away. He did it by slitting their throats along here from ear to ear. And the advantage of that is that he silences here, the voice box. He also cuts here in the neck, the carotid artery, and that makes the blood flow behind the victim as he pulls them down onto the ground. The advantage of that, as you can see in the images, is that all the blood flows behind the head and it keeps the corpse really clean. Then he does something quite unusual. He opens the torso in a cut from the neck right down to the navel, and then he cuts open from side to side, and that's called a crucial incision. That way he can get at all the organs, and of course serial killers often like to do that. Very peculiarly, he places the legs in a triangular position, in much the way that you might be asked to do if you're in hospital lying on your back and then you put your legs up in a triangle position with your feet on the ground. And that is unusual, and we don't understand why he did that. Well, in the Lancet at the time, Wayne Baxter, the coroner who received the victims, in this case Mary Ann Nichols, made this comment, and it's one worth thinking about. The injuries that were made by someone had considerable anatomical skill and knowledge. There were no meaningless cuts. The organ, he means the area above the vagina, had been taken by one who knew where to find it, what difficulties you would have in finding it, and how you should use a knife to get the organs out without injuring the organs themselves. Notice what he says here in the Lancet. No unskilled person could have known where to find it or to have recognised where it was found. In fact, it would have taken you a lot of skill with a knife somewhere, either doing animal work, surgical work, or anatomical work, to be able to murder in the way that Jack did. The big question is, where did Jack learn this, and how did he disguise himself accordingly? Another question we'll be asking, and our students are working on this at the moment, is was it a sex crime or not? Well, actually, although Jack certainly attacked the sex organs of these 5 iconic victims, there is no conclusive evidence of a sex crime. He didn't touch the body in the way that you might expect a pathological killer to do so. That doesn't mean to say that he wasn't very dangerous. It just means to say that he enjoyed the aspect of killing, but he didn't necessarily have a sex crime in mind when he was doing it. So is there another medical explanation? Because we seem to need one in this set of crimes. Then we need to ask ourselves this question. Did he have an accomplice? 4 out of 5 of his victims were suspected to be prostitutes. There is a lot of historical debate about that, and we will be looking at quite closely. Whether they were prostitutes or not, these were people who were streetwise. These women were inured to the really rough clientele that frequented all of the public houses on the street. Remember I said there was one at the top of the street, one in the middle, and one at the end. So why did these women not run away when they were approached? Remember, as the murders went on and there were more and more people being murdered, they would have been more wary. So how did Jack reassure them? What was his deadly disguise? Did he maybe have a female accomplice? Did she approach them first and then join Jack on the street scene? And if so, where in Dorset Street might the evidence be of this? Well, above all, what we're going to look at is this clue. Through the alleyway with the orange arrow, you can see that there is a what's called an inner court. And up that inner court lived the last victim, called Mary Jane Kelly. She was brutally murdered up inside that inner court. It really is and was quite a ghastly murder. Just in front of the court, there was something called a shed shop, and you can see it with the yellow arrow. The Metropolitan Police closed it up. It only contained a wheelbarrow, and yet we know that 4 out of 5 victims met on Dorset Street in that shed shop. So the question is this: what was that shed shop? Was it connected to Mary Jane living up the alleyway? Was it connected to her landlord, John McCarthy, who was actually investigated but exonerated from the deaths? And why did Mary Ann Nichols, one of his victims, say, on visiting the shed shop, "I'll get my DOS money and look what a jolly bonnet I've got now"? The Metropolitan Police didn't want to talk about the shed shop, and they didn't want anybody advertising it in any of the newspapers at the time. So we, in our course, we're going to go back to that shed shop and we're going to ask questions about the means, the method, and the motive for murder. Because if you don't have all 3 of those, then you can't actually figure out who Jack is. And there's no book that I know of that has been published on Jack the Ripper that's brought those 3 elements together. So let's finish here. The medical clues are in a history of hidden lives in the East End of London of 1888. If 4 out of 5 of Jack's victims used that shed shop on Dorset Street and the Metropolitan Police boarded it up and never wanted to speak about it again, then we need to go back there to solve this mystery. I hope that you'll join me in doing so. It certainly is a fascinating period in the Victorian times, and one that in the School of History we are very keen to relook at, to share the forensic evidence of, and to really sift evidence in the way that historians do. I hope you'll join me. If there's anybody who's got any questions, I'd love to answer them, and I'm just going to look into the live question and answer event, and I've got a couple here. Someone's just keyed in and asked me, did I think Jack the Ripper was a doctor? Well, there were actually at the time a lot of media commentary about whether he was a doctor or not. As I'm sure you can appreciate, the Lancet was very keen to distance itself from that outcome. In reality, I don't think he was a doctor, but I do think he was involved in some way in medicine. And that's part of the mystery that we'll be investigating on the course, because he can't have had that sort of anatomical skill, those sort of cuts. He can't murder that fast without acquiring it somewhere. Someone else has asked me about the accomplice theory, and do I think that he had an accomplice? Yes, I do. I don't see how, when the murders went on, these streetwise women wouldn't have been aware of the fact that they should be more wary on the street scene. So somehow Jack is able to walk up to them, even though 4 or 5 or 6 women have been murdered, and he's able to approach them. He's really, really clever at social wallpaper. He's very, very good at being banal. But if he has an accomplice, that would have really helped him. It's been lovely meeting you all today, and I hope that if you're interested, key into some of our other live lectures that we're going to offer soon. And do email me on eh140@le.ac.uk if you'd like to have a bit more of a chat. I'd be more than willing to answer more questions from you. Take care.